Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello. So we will begin with the second week of this course, Sustainable Engineering Principles. I am assuming that you have listened to the videos posted for week 1. So the main focus of week 1 instructions was we focused on ecosystem goods and services and how they are essential for human well-being. We also saw that several of the ecosystem goods and services are rapidly degrading. And we also saw evidences that human actions are directly responsible for this degradation. So the obvious question that should come to your mind is, why do we continue to harm the environment? If there are so many indicators, so many examples of degradation of environment, and we are also aware of its effect on human well-being, then why do we continue to harm the environment? And it's a very difficult question to answer. It's not a very straightforward question to answer. So let me start by giving you some examples or some evidences which show that environment has been a topic of importance for some time or almost forever, and then we'll try to understand why still it gets ignored in terms of actual action. So let me start with religion. A lot of old religions are existing, and people follow some or the other religion. Most people follow some or the other religion. And if you take any religion, you will find that there is always some mention of environmental protection. So if I talk about Hinduism, there are statements like do not cut trees because they remove pollution. There is mention of deforestation and destruction of forest, which should be avoided. So there are these mentions. If you take Islam, it also talks about protecting the environment. Christianity also. So the point being made here is that religion values the environment, and so many people follow religion, but still nobody seems to actually care for the environment when it comes to actual action. We are also not the first ones to be concerned about the environmental problems. It's not that suddenly in the last 10-15 years people have woken up and suddenly realized that there is a problem with the environment. That is certainly not the fact. And I'll give you again some examples. So Pluto, who lived around 5th century BC, he actually had discussed about different problems of the environment because of human activity. And he talked about things like farming, logging, mining, and so on. Jumping to 16th century, there was a German engineer who described the negative impacts of wood cutting and mining on wildlife. Coming closer to our current time, if you look at the 19th century, the main energy source in 19th century was coal. Coal was used for pretty much every energy application, and Stanley Jevons, who was an economist in the UK, he actually published a book where he raised this question about use of coal from a sustainability perspective. He particularly highlighted the fact that coal is limited in quantity. So if you start using it more, it's going to get exhausted, and we will end up in a situation where we have no energy source. Now, fortunately for us, the 20th century was mainly driven by oil, because we found crude oil which had more energy density, easier to handle, somewhat cleaner, and therefore most of the energy production in the 20th century focused on using crude oil. But that also came with its own environmental problems, and there were some questions raised about use of crude oil. So I have given the screenshots of some books that came out in late 1940s and early 50s, which essentially raised this issue of continued environmental degradation. So, and there are several other examples. The point I am trying to make here is that there has always been a concern about the environment right from the beginning of our human society, and yet very paradoxically we still continue to harm the environment. So that's a very, very interesting question. Why is it happening? So I want to discuss what has happened to the society in general. Have we progressed in terms of the conventional definition of progress? And I'll give you some examples. So what I have plotted in this slide is global GDP per capita. Now GDP is gross domestic product, and it essentially captures how much manufacturing is happening in the country or globally. And if you look at any discussion on economics, the condition of national economy, typically GDP is discussed. And higher the GDP, better it is, because the argument given is that there is more manufacturing, more jobs, more income, and so on. And what you see on this chart is that the global GDP per capita has been steadily rising since 1870, and particularly since the end of the Second World War, around late 40s, it has actually risen very rapidly. And that's a good thing. From an economic perspective, increasing GDP, as I have already said, is a good thing. So that seems to be going well. We seem to be making good progress on that. Let's look at life expectancy. And life expectancy also has risen significantly. In fact, the trend is much more, the increase is much sharp as compared to the global GDP numbers I showed on the previous slide. And here I have numbers for both world and India. And you can see that starting from, let's say, around 1900, so about 100 to 120 years ago, there is a sharp increase in global life expectancy as well as life expectancy in India. So the point is, people are living longer. The GDP per capita is increasing. That means they are earning more. I have also extracted data related to education levels, literacy. And this slide shows how the fraction of literate people has changed over time. So blue region indicates the fraction of literate people or the percentage of literate people globally. And the red indicates percentage of illiterate population. And it clearly shows that, again, starting from, let's say, around 1900, there is a sharp increase in the education levels. So the percentage of literate population has increased significantly. So the point of these three slides was, if you look at these together, the point is, as a human society, we have definitely made progress. We have started earning more. Our GDP numbers are increasing. Our life expectancy is increasing. The population is getting more and more educated. So it seems to be going very well. As a society, you can actually make an argument that we are doing very well, especially since the Industrial Revolution. Unfortunately, and that's where the problem comes. Remember, I asked you the question, why do we still continue to harm the environment? And really the crux of the matter is what we consider as progress or growth. And unfortunately, that definition of progress or growth has been flawed. So as this cartoon on the left shows, the general view has been that if you have to progress economically, or if you have to progress, grow as a society, particularly from an economic perspective, you have to consider environmental degradation as a side effect. There is no way to avoid it. So starting with the Industrial Revolution, the view was that progress is mainly about economic growth. You need to produce more, you need to consume more. There was also an inherent assumption that in order to make progress, you have to use science to dominate over nature. So many of the technologies essentially were designed to ensure that we overcome nature. And the assumption also was that if there are any environmental problems, science will find a way. So maybe there is a problem today because what we are doing, but we have science and technology, and eventually science and technology will find a way out. So basically the idea was human progress was assumed to be linked to economic growth and material advancement. And I'm saying this purely from a Western perspective, because a lot of the early development, especially the industrial development, happened in the Western world, and many of these Western countries were ruling the other regions of the world. So whatever theories, whatever views that they had about growth and society were actually implemented and adopted by other regions of the world. So whatever the concepts Western world had about progress and growth was actually diffused or adapted by many other regions. But the point being made here is that it's a flawed assumption. And there have been several examples about negative impacts of growth. So the pictures that I'm showing here are from the US. The one on the left hand side is of a river which has caught fire because of excessive pollution. Now this happened in 1969. The picture on the right is of New York City again in 1960s, and you can see that there is a lot of smoke around, and this was mainly because of waste burning and coal burning power plants. So the lot of soot and smoke that they were generating was completely covering the whole New York City. Now, if we think of US as a developed country, and much of their economic development happened in the 60s, 70s and 80s. But these two pictures show that there were definitely negative effects of economic growth. And if you look at the situation of India currently, we are probably going through the same phase, because many of these pictures are similar to what is happening right now in India. We have rivers catching fire, foam coming out of lakes. We have smog problems in most of the major cities. So, the learning outcomes of this particular module are that first, we have made significant progress as a human society, but economic growth was the central goal of human society. So progress was measured primarily in terms of economic growth, and it was assumed that environmental degradation was an unavoidable outcome of growth, and there have been consequences. So I would like you to look at this additional video that I have posted on this on this slide here, which further discusses the importance of sustainability and some of the challenges. So I am giving you some examples on this slide. These are considered as very important books that initiated this concept of sustainability and sustainable development. This last book, particularly The Limits of Growth, is considered to be the most important contribution in this area. In this book, the authors basically predicted that if we continue the way we are developing, and if we continue to focus on economic growth, then in about 70 to 80 years from 1972, so let's say around 1940 or 1950, 2040 or 2050, we will end up with a situation where all the resources will be consumed and the humans will start dying because of famine. And that sort of alarmed everybody. And suddenly there was a movement about environmental protection. The first Earth Day was celebrated in 1970. So in general, there was more and more interest about protecting the environment and moving away from purely economic growth. And mind you, this was happening primarily in developed countries, because much of the rest of the world, particularly Asia, South America and Africa, was still underdeveloped. So they had still not encountered some of the problems that the developed countries were encountering. So the focus then shifted to sustainable development. But the question was, what do we actually mean by sustainability, or what is the definition of sustainable development? There is certainly a dictionary meaning. Sustainability word has been around in the English language for a long time, and the standard dictionary meaning is that sustainability is the quality of being able to continue over a period of time. And that's a very generic definition of sustainability. I am sure all of you have come across this term before, and you in general know what do we mean by sustainability. But what is the interpretation of sustainability in this particular context when we start talking about environmental protection and human development? So So in order to answer that question, United Nations set up a commission. It is popularly known as the Brundtland Commission. That's because the person who was heading this commission, her last name was Brundtland. Basically, the commission consisted of several important people from different areas globally. And they came together and started debating about and brainstorming about what do we mean by sustainable development. So, as I said, this commission was set up in 1984, and in 1987 they finally came up with a report which is known as the Brundtland Commission report, and they came up with the first formal definition of sustainability. And this is the definition that is very commonly quoted in literature on sustainability. And the definition says that sustainable development is the development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of the future generation to meet their own needs. So essentially what this definition says is that whatever we do today, whatever decision that we make today, be it in terms of using energy, using resources, polluting the environment, whatever we decide to do today should not compromise the ability of the future generation to do the same things or meet their needs. So let's say 50 years, 30 years down the line, whatever they need at that time should be provided by nature. So that was the essential, the central point of that definition. There is also an alternate definition of sustainability which says that it's the capacity of our human society to continue indefinitely within the Earth's natural cycles. There are also definitions from different perspectives. So what I've shown here is the first definition on the slide is a definition from business point of view. And it says that a sustainable product or a process is one that constrains resource consumption and waste generation to an acceptable level. It makes positive contribution to the satisfaction of the human needs and provides enduring economic value to the business enterprise. So the definition on the previous slide was very generic, very broad, and that definition has been adapted by different domains based on their focus area. So for example, business view talks about human needs because businesses typically produce a product to meet a human need, be it clothing or food or transportation vehicles and so on. So there is a certain human need which is met by a business. So they talk about human needs. They also talk about economic value because businesses invariably focus on economic value. That's one of the criteria they consider as that defines the success or failure of the business. So there is this, if you compare this definition with what you saw on the previous slide, it's a bit more specific to the business view. I'm sure you would also have come across this very popular term called as triple bottom line, which people in business community use very frequently. And essentially this triple bottom line means that you have three criteria to decide the success of a business. You have profit, you have people, so how does it help society in general, and planet, basically environment. So this is known as PPP or 3Ps, the triple bottom line. I am also giving a definition that is given in AICHE by AICHE. So AICHE is the American Institute of Chemical Engineers. It says that sustainability occurs when we maintain or improve the material and social conditions for human health and the environment over time without exceeding the ecological capabilities. So it's very similar to the business view that I have mentioned above. And there are other definitions also. If you just do a simple Google search of sustainable development or sustainability, you will get several other definitions. But if you look at all these definitions, although the text might be different, there are certain features that are common to all these definitions. So I would like to highlight those common features in most of the sustainability definitions. One, and first most important, is that all the definitions are human-centric or anthropocentric. And this is very important because in the first few modules of this course, I talked about how biodiversity is important, how saving animals is important, saving plants is important. But if you look at all the definitions of sustainability, they essentially talk about human well-being. And it's a very interesting contradiction that we don't really want to save the environment because we really care about the environment. We want to save the environment because we need the environment for our own well-being. So essentially all the definitions are about human well-being, or how to ensure that we as a human race survive. So as I said, all the definitions are human-centric. Secondly, all definitions talk about present and future. So they say that whatever we do in today's time will have an implication in future, and that has to be considered. So there is a acknowledgement that the future needs to be accounted for in our decision making. The third aspect is that it recognizes the role of nature. So if you look at the business definition or even the AICHE definition that I mentioned on the previous slide, it had mentions about the limits of the nature, or you have to use resources within the limits of the nature. So there is a recognition that whatever resources that we are using and are provided by nature, we have to use those resources judiciously. So nature plays an important role in all the activities that we do. So there is an underlying recognition of the role of nature. And the fourth is that it acknowledges the limits imposed by nature. So as I said, all these definitions acknowledge that there is a limit to which we can use natural resources. Beyond that, it is not good, because either it cannot be renewed at the same rate, or we are using it so fast that the future generation will have a problem. So these are the four common features. So if you take any definition on sustainability, you will invariably find that these 4 points are captured in some ways in that definition. So I'm showing this concept of sustainability using a picture. So sustainability, it is often said, has 3 dimensions: environment, economy, and society. So these are also known as sustainability pillars. Now this is very important because a lot of times when we talk about sustainability, the assumption is that it is all about environmental protection. We only have to protect the environment, and that is what sustainability is. And that is something that is not true. It is a very important point to note here, is that sustainability is not only about environmental protection. It is about environmental protection, no doubt, but it is also about economic viability and societal acceptance. And that's why we have these 3 pillars or 3 dimensions of sustainability, which is environment, economy, and society. And whatever is the combination, so if you look at this figure carefully, the intersection of these 3 circles is what I'm calling a sustainable. And I'll give you several examples in the next couple of modules where we will discuss this, because as soon as you look at this figure, it is very obvious that there are trade-offs. There are some solutions or some technologies or some products which might be economically very attractive but not environmentally benign. So there is a trade-off, and that has to be acknowledged. That's a central part of sustainability debate. There is another view of sustainability which says that environment is actually all-encompassing. Without the environment, we won't have anything, and that actually makes sense because, as I said in the first few modules, that most of the things that we need for our well-being are provided by the environment and nature. So this view says that there is environment, within that there is society, and then within that there is economy. So if you don't have the environment, the economy cannot survive. So this is another way of sustainability. The point here is that the sustainability concerns go well beyond global warming and climate change. They talk about resource depletion, things like sanitation and access to water. There is concern about energy security and access to energy. There is talk about food and nutrition, gender disparity, and so on. So this concept of sustainability is much more than just global warming or climate change. And I'll give you one example of what I mean by that. Now, this first figure on the left is what I had shown in the previous modules, where I showed that the primary energy consumption globally has been increasing rapidly. And I also showed that this increase in energy consumption is directly responsible for the CO2 emissions in the atmosphere. Now, if you take a very environment-centric view, you might say that, okay, I want to protect the environment. I want to reduce the impact of global warming. For that, I need to reduce the CO2 emissions. And because energy consumption is primarily responsible for CO2 emissions, the obvious solution is to reduce the energy consumption. And that makes sense. Logically, this argument makes sense. But the question is that really a sustainable solution? And that's where the concept of sustainability and environmental protection differ. And in order to make my point, I'll discuss the second figure on the right. So this figure shows on x-axis you have per capita primary power consumption in kilowatt per person, and on y-axis there is human development index. Now we have not yet studied what is human development index, but it's a number between 0 and 1, and closer to 1 is better. That means the development is more. And if you look at this chart, there is a clear observation that as the per capita power consumption increases, the human development index increases. So, if I say that in order to save the environment, we just have to reduce our energy consumption, that may not actually make sense, because up to a certain point, let's say around 5 kilowatt per person, around this point, increase in energy consumption leads to significant increase in human development. Now, beyond a certain point, obviously there is less benefit. Beyond a certain point, if you consume more and more energy, the benefit in terms of human development is much less. But up to a certain point, there is a very strong correlation. So obviously, just reducing the energy consumption is not a good idea, especially for a country like India, where much of the population is still energy deprived. We cannot say that as a country we will just reduce our energy consumption, because we are actually in a region on this curve where we should be consuming more energy in order to ensure that human development is the human development index increases, or basically that the society is developing. So that's an important distinction. That's just one example of how sustainability and environmental protection are different.